Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Chow, and I'm the Vice President of Research at Holland-Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which Holland-Bloorview stands. This land is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Today marks the 10th anniversary of the Pursuit Award ceremony. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this inaugural online format of the event, which celebrates leaders in childhood disability research from across the world. As many of you know, and for the benefits of our external guests joining us this morning, Holland-Bloorview is in the midst of a fundraising campaign to grow and expand the Research Institute. This means celebrating world-class developmental neuroscience and includes a fully accessible child-friendly research MRI suite that is about to be up and running, recruiting top scientific talent, creating 9 new discovery hubs, and accelerating our commercialization efforts. This campaign will support a 11,000 square feet addition to accommodate our research expansion. Once completed, BRI will have the highest concentration of childhood disability research anywhere in the world. This entirely donor-funded campaign will help us drive toward client and family-centered research to make transformational discoveries for the most meaningful and healthy futures for all children and youth and families. Now, as I mentioned, this is the 10th anniversary of the Pursuit Award, and I learned that for the 10th anniversary gift, it's actually the gift of tin or aluminum. So given this a tin anniversary, we decided to shake things up a little. So we dropped the keynote speaker. That was supposed to be a joke. I want to thank Manny for his ingenuity in orchestrating this new online format in short order. It's very impressive. But don't you think that getting rid of the audience was going a bit too far? That was supposed to be another joke. Okay. So all joking aside, it's perhaps fitting that the 10th Pursuit Award ceremony is done a bit differently. After a decade, it's perhaps time for us to reflect on how to change, how to adapt, how to evolve so that the event remains relevant, while at the same time continuing to reflect our core values of courage and resilience, compassion, excellence, equity, and innovation. Indeed, as former US President Jimmy Carter put it, we must adjust to changing times and still hold to unchanging principles. It is thus reassuring to me personally that amid all the uncertainty, instability, and all that is unfamiliar, there are some things that remain certain, stable, and familiar. And I dare say that one of those unwavering, tenaciously anchored monoliths is that which unites us this morning. A world with no boundaries for children, youth, and families living with disability. A future that is most personally meaningful and healthy for all children and youth. Thank you to each of you for making the decision to sign in to the event this morning. Your presence, virtual as it may be, is witness to the power of our shared vision here at Holland-Bloorview. Desmond Tutu, South African bishop, said that your ordinary acts of love and hope point to the extraordinary promise that every human life is of inestimable value. The annual Pursuit Award ceremony is an opportunity to recognize PhD students and recent graduates for their impactful contributions to childhood disability. Every year, the applications we receive are forward-thinking, innovative, and challenge prevalent schools of thought in rehabilitation science. Verily, the notions of health, concepts of participation, and intervention paradigms. Over the years, applicants have hailed from numerous nations, including New Zealand, Switzerland, Brazil, Israel, USA, and India. Congratulations to our finalists for being selected to present this year. We're thankful for your inspiring work and dedication to furthering childhood disability research. I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank our judging panel. This year, the esteemed panel included Sally Lindsay, Darcy Fellings, Fiona Mola, Jillian King, Shannon Scratch, Shauna Kingsnorth, Amy McPherson, Derek Beal, Melanie Penner, and Hanai Davis. In our condensed online version of the event, each of our 3 finalists will present their research and receive an award thereafter. That's not bad. There's no pressure actually, because there's a prize guarantee. And I should read the fine print that
acceptance of the prize assumes that the winner and his or her Zoom companions have read and understood these official rules and regulations, accepts the prize as offered, and releases the harm from any and all liability of any kind arising out of the potential winner's participation in pursuit award and receipt and use of the prize. Prizes must be accepted as awarded. The prize may not be sold, transferred, and is not convertible to cash.
So with that, I would like to invite Lindsay Hutchison, Senior Manager of Philanthropy, to give thanks to our donors for supporting the Pursuit Awards for the past decade. Because of their continuing support, many students and postdoctoral fellows have been able to continue to advance their critical work in childhood disability research. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, everyone. It's my great privilege today to acknowledge the Ward family for their outstanding generosity in funding these awards for the past decade. I'm sure when David and Anne made this gift that they had no idea the different circumstances that we would be facing today in the research community. And I know that their gift is going to have a profound impact on our finalists today and on research in general. We know that philanthropy will play an increasingly important role in this critical time of health research, and we just want to thank the Ward family for their partnership. I'd like to acknowledge Colin, who's joined us on the call today, and thank him for the role that he plays in the Holland Bloor Review family and the many different ways he supports our community. Thank you to Robin, David, and Colin for their generosity and for funding this program. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm now thrilled to present our three finalists. Each finalist will give his or her presentation. We will then have a live question and answer period with our audience following each presentation. If you'd like to pose a question to our presenter, please use the chat function to submit your question. Our first presenter of the morning is Dr. Patrick Jakira. He completed his PhD in rehabilitation science at the University of Toronto and is now a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. His research examines how physical activity participation impacts the mental and physical health of children and adolescents with neurodevelopmental disorders. In the community, Patrick is the co-founder and former director of the Extraordinary Youth Council Program, a community recreation program for youth and young adults with neurodevelopmental disorders. Please welcome Patrick.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to pull up my slides here. Thanks again for having me as a finalist. It's an honor and privilege to have been selected for the Pursuit Awards. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my doctoral research, which looked at physical activity with youth, and especially boys with autism spectrum disorder. So we know that physical activity participation can contribute to a number of positive physical, mental, and psychosocial benefits, from finding routines and establishing positive health habits to making friends and communicating. The research has unequivocally said that there's a benefit to being physically active. For children and youth with autism spectrum disorder, though, they are less likely to be active, and this is consistent across the board and across the globe. What also tends to happen is that they are less active in school-based activities, school sports, and even in the community. What also is seen in the literature is that they become less active in adolescence. So as they get older, as you can imagine, they are becoming less active over time and are also participating in less active things both within and beyond the community. What is unclear, though, is why they are inactive. There's a lot of research going on to try and look at what are some of the biophysical markers of their inactivity, so things such as issues with gross motor skills, running, jumping, throwing, and also things that are psychobehavioral, so things such as motivation or overstimulation through a sensory kind of pathway. What we haven't really looked at, though, are the social, cultural, and political factors that might shape their participation. So trying to really take a step back to look at how do wider social contextual factors shape their lives, and in this case, their participation. And what I was interested in specifically was to look at how do the bio kind of factors interact with the psychological ones and the social ones, and how do those then work together to impact the participation. The other research gap is that there's been little research conducted with adolescents with ASD in general. A lot of the work has focused on parents and caregivers, clinicians, but we actually haven't done a very good job of engaging youth themselves, both within a physical activity setting and beyond. So given those gaps, my PhD research sought to explore the thoughts and experiences of physical activity participation among adolescents. I then worked to interpret how do these broader social and cultural processes, which kind of make up their daily lives, influence their participation. Then to take that context and integrate that into wider biological and psychobehavioral factors that have been described in the literature and that kind of shape their daily lives. So my work was framed within a critical qualitative framework. And so I chose this framework to move merely beyond just describing the barriers and facilitators. We've done a pretty good job in the literature describing kind of the barriers such as, lack of time or lack of resources, but such an approach didn't really take into account what are those broader macro level things happening in society that are influencing their daily lives and their participation. So by taking a critical approach, I was really interested in understanding how our beliefs, kind of habits, attitudes, influencing the daily lives of individuals with autism spectrum disorder, and then how does that relate to activity participation. To kind of get at that bigger question of the interaction between the social and the individual, I drew on Norbert Elias's figurational sociology. So I use this concept of the figuration to look at how we are interconnected from both a wider social standpoint, so how are we connected as individuals within our own family, but also shaped by our institutions, by culture, by politics. In that concept of figuration, I also drew on Elias's concept of the hinge to really get at the interaction between the bio, psycho, and the social, where Elias argued that the bio and psycho and social are always fundamentally interacting together. So speech, for example, needs to have a biological component to generate verbal speech, but speech is only made valuable socially if we have a social structure or a social code that gives it some sort of meaning. So the hinge was a way for me to integrate the bio, psych, and social processes and again, examine how that worked together to shape participation. And then I also drew on the concept of habitus to look at how unconscious schemes of perception or experiences guide how individuals see the world. So in my PhD work, I worked with 10 adolescent boys with autism spectrum disorder. They were aged between 12 to 19 years. What we did is we created digital stories. So it's something similar to a YouTube video, which are about 1 to 3 minutes in duration. And they looked at their physical activity experiences, their beliefs, ideas of how they imagine physical activity to be. They also participated in 2 interviews. So we had one before the digital stories and one after, to really first to get to know their lives a little bit better and to spend more time building rapport. And then secondly, to use the second interview to really break down and talk about what they included in their digital story. And then we also included some observation on us before and after digital story workshops and the interviews themselves. So the analysis was driven by combining the digital stories and the interviews. So I looked for kind of similarities, differences, and importantly, contradictions. What was said in a digital story that was potentially contradicted in the interview and vice versa. And really it's these contradictions that served as point of departure to then speak with the adolescents during the second interview to get a better understanding of their thoughts and beliefs around activity. And then the work was also driven through Elias's concepts that I talked about and the critical framework of the study to again understand the interactions between how individuals are shaped by the broader social and cultural environments. So to begin, I want to show Alan's digital story. Alan is a pseudonym name chosen by the participant. And I'm going to play it for you. All right, so that was a sample digital story of what the youth created. There were 10 of them created, 10 very different stories, I might add as well. The most exciting part, probably my PhD, was working with the youth directly and spending about 25 hours with each youth. Really got me the opportunity to really understand what their daily lives are like and to build relationships with people, because sometimes those intricacies are not always covered in research. So as part of the analysis and building on Alan's digital story, I'm going to provide 2 examples of physical activity participation and kind of the mediators therein. So to show the interaction of the biocycle and the social, Alan's digital story really talks about how his biological challenges of the hyperlaxity of his knees and his elbows, for example, shape his physical activity. So in his interview, for example, he really talks about knowing that exercise is good for him, but also he has to be careful because that's what he's been told by his parents, by teachers, and by healthcare professionals. And while of course we can't discount the importance of understanding that there's this real biological risk to dislocate, which he did before and did a second time, what was important in Alan's interviews was that what came out was that his fear of injury also came out from the social situation that he was in, where every single day he has almost become hypervigilant to not be active. And even though he's now taken up walking, that has come from a long time of fear and anxiety and stress about being active. And so what Alan's data shows us is that kids necessarily aren't unmotivated or are lazy, as has been described in the literature, but also shows us that the biological aspects of his hyperlaxity are shaped by his social situation. So that was what we would call the habitus. Where his ideas to be active are really fundamentally influenced by who he's around, interactions he has in rehabilitation, which generally have told him to really avoid activity, but to do it in a safe way. So again, that's the interaction between the psycho, bio, and the social. The different example with showing what impacts physical activity participation, I draw it on participant Jas, who in his narrative really talked about bullying and how that shaped his life. So on the photo on the right, you'll see that he included a picture of the steps that he did during a walk during a day. So you can see that he did 14,609 steps according to the step counter, about 10 kilometers. And Jas was really good at explaining physical activity participation. He knew all the benefits. He can rhyme off every single kind of guideline. But what was interesting in his life was that despite knowing these kind of benefits, there was this real reluctance based on his life experiences. And part of that had to do with the fact of his building experiences, both within and beyond the school context, where anytime he tried to be active, there were a lot of instances in which he had negative experiences, and those negative experiences over time shaped his habitus, in which he learned to almost hate it. And so part of that is captured in his quote where he says, "Being active is just not for me. I've tried it and I hate it. When I think of activity, I think of all the names I've been called and getting beat up. I don't see the point of doing exercise. I feel like vomiting after most classes because it stresses me out. I'd rather just avoid exercise as much as I can." So again, a lot of the biological literature to date has talked about, the importance of working on gross motor skills and fixing those through rehabilitation. But what Jas's interview and some of the other broader data that has talked about bullying in my PhD work highlights that these social circumstances are also major driving forces of both inactivity and a potential hate to be inactive. So what are some of the implications of my work? I think one of the major things is to really challenge this idea that physical activity is simply individual level behavior, where it's something that we either have the drive or the passion to do it or not. That's been kind of really the dominant rhetoric in the literature, but at the same time, we've noticed that it's really widely shaped by the social circumstances of these participants' lives, and whether it's bullying to a biological injury to that interaction of the hyperlaxity to the social circumstances and the psychological processes. Some of my research really goes to highlight that boys are not naturally unmotivated or are drawn to sedentary activities, which have been previously talked about the literature as the main driving forces. Some of the other implications is that we need to think about physical activity not always as a panacea or a good thing or medicine that we always must try and include and fix, but also think about what are some of the unintended effects. So across the literature, physical activity is often positioned as this great thing that we should all do, and we should put all our efforts into finding ways in which we can enhance it, but also we need to be cognizant of how do we then balance that and those potential benefits with potential unintended effects. And some of the narratives of the participants, such as bullying and learning how to hate it, is a perfect example of how we need to think about those balances as we move forward. And I think the major implication is that I'm trying to argue that we need to really start to think about the biopsychal and social aspects of participation as being integrated and not working in isolation. So far we've done a really good job of really focusing on the biological and psychological aspects, which we use to plan programs such as rehabilitation, but also we need to really be cognizant of the social processes and the broader and cultural factors and assumptions that drive either our ability to provide programs for individuals with autism spectrum disorder or not. So I'm arguing one way to move forward is to really to start thinking about the biopsychal and socials perspectives and forces as interconnected rather than as separate entities as we've thought about them. In terms of future research, my PhD work only worked with boys, given that there was also an interest to understand how masculinity was a factor that drove participation. I didn't talk about that today for the purposes of time. But future research definitely with girls with ASD is definitely warranted, given that there might be differences, and also just there's nothing really been done in the area yet. The second thing is that we need to work on figuring out alternative options to be active across the participants. There was really a focus on just sport as what they conceptualize activity to be. I think if we find ways in which we can promote different forms of activity and different opportunities, that might be one way rather than trying to fit them all to just doing kind of traditional sport-based models. And I argue that we need to focus on developing the whole person. So that would be not just including them in behavior therapy or other sort of therapies that guide and interventions that guide early childhood, but also to include PA and other forms of recreation, such as art, as part of our goals to develop children to be healthy and active over time. To close, I just want to acknowledge the study participants and their families. Really, it's been an honor to get to know their lives, and it's a real privilege as a PhD researcher to spend that much time with them. I also want to thank Dr. Barbara Gibson, Dr. Evdokia Anagnostou, Dr. Brittany Glasson, and Dr. Rebecca Renwick for their supervision and mentorship throughout my PhD work. And this research would not have been possible without several funding supports, including the Kimmel family from the Kimmel Family Graduate Student Scholarship, Pediatric Disability, and Pediatric Rehabilitation for Pollen Delivery. Thank you so much, and I welcome questions at this time.
Thank you, Patrick. As we wait for a few questions, I have one that's kind of top of mind, if you wouldn't mind me asking. Really exciting research that you've done, Patrick. I'm just wondering, I mean, it seems from your findings, the social factors, one could argue, outweigh the biopsychosocial enablers in many ways. And I'm just wondering, and I take your point that these are all interlinked dimensions, but I'm wondering, what are some practical kind of social interventions? Because it seems that, to address this challenge, we're going well beyond, conventional population health kind of interventions, right? These need to be very targeted interventions. I'm wondering if you have any idea how to even start to tackle that challenge.
Absolutely, and I think there definitely are challenges in developing change. But one way in which I think we can start to work toward that is to really acknowledge the complexity of family lives and the social forces. So similar as we know that some families have challenges with coming to clinical appointments, for example, when designing programs and opportunities to be active or even interventions, I mean, to be able to provide flexibility for families is one broader social piece that sometimes is missing. A lot of programs that participants talked about were really fixed on, for example, being 9 weeks, and if they missed 3 weeks, they'd be kicked out. But those programs, for example, don't take into account those broader social factors of what it is to potentially be raising a child with autism, right? So having that flexibility and adaptability in society, both in programs, but also supports. There was a few stories of participants who told me that they were kicked out of programs because they didn't have a personal support worker. And I know how Blue Review were keen on including participation, but it's hard to do so when policies at a systemic level, at that broader macro level, are ones also excluding our ability to include people. So working at the macro level, at the broader systems level, and then working within those interconnections, I think is a way forward. And part of that is accomplished through policy, but also through the ways in which we conceptualize physical activity. So not just being a sport-based event, but also including other forms of activity, such as walking or Zumba or dancing, that haven't traditionally been offered in community and school-based settings necessarily.
Thanks, Patrick. Lots of great ideas. We do have one question from the audience here, and I'll just read it out for you. Did any participants discuss their bodily and sensory experiences during physical activity as a factor in seeking or avoiding physical activity?
That's a great question. I have an entire section written on a paper that is just about to be released very shortly about that. That section is what we call the sensuality of sweat, and the sensuality being senses. And some participants talked about sweat, for example, and senses as being things that were both factors that brought them toward activity, but also being aversive. So I'll give you an example of both. One participant talked about the sense of calm and relaxation by being active and really enjoying kind of the water. So he was a swimmer and enjoying this sense of the water rushing over his skin. And that sense of the water over his skin and over his hair, he told me, was one of the most calming effects of activity that we often don't talk about. We always talk about the biophysical factors that are associated with activity. But for this participant, he highlighted that sensory piece of the water running over him was what helped calm him down. And after a long day or a stressful day at school, going to activity was one of his outlets. The flip side of that was one person who talked about sweat and how sweat was really what pushed him away from activity, and that nasty feeling of being sticky and muggy and yucky. He said he'd just rather avoid it at all costs if he could, unless you included AC. That was his caveat. So it was just really interesting to see, again, that interconnection between body, mind, and environment really working together. And we know that the sensory pieces of autism are really big and important, from noise to sweat. And again, we can't discount that as we talk about the wider social factors as well. Great question. Thank you for that. We do have that in the paper coming out very soon, so stay tuned.
Great, thanks, Patrick. We have one follow-up question to the first question. And it says how this, and I'm assuming that's referring to participation, might be related to meeting social expectations for physical activity.
Thank you for that one, Tom. I think there definitely is this kind of social pressure to get kids more active, part based on what's happening in society, where there's lots of pressure from families and organizations to get kids more active more generally. But the second piece is what the participants talked about themselves, where, physical activity necessarily has benefits, but also there are drawbacks. And the bullying aspects of the 10 participants, I would say, I believe 6 participants talked about bullying. And for 4 of them specifically, it was the major reason why they dropped out. And so as much as we want to spend time to promote activity and understand that it's a good thing, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that it does have multiple effects and it can be damaging. And the one thing we do know in the general population is that generally kids and adolescents who are inactive during that period are generally inactive as adults as well. So part of promoting physical activity, I think, also needs to start with how we conceptualize activity, and to reframe models that are hyperly focused on competition and aggression and bullying, because that is what's kind of driving kids away from being active. And if we can find ways in which we have pedagogies and strategies and programs in which we can promote a more wholesome and inclusive environment, I think that'd be one way to move forward. We haven't really done so well in the field to move away from just using sports. I think if we start using or promoting alternative activities to be active, that would be one way forward.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I think that's all the time that we have. I want to thank the folks who posed questions. And I think there's a lot of important learnings here, even for our present circumstances amidst a pandemic situations in terms of your research. So thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our second presenter this morning, Dr. Emily Ho. Emily is an occupational therapist who completed her doctoral studies at the University of Toronto Rehabilitation Science Institute under the supervision of our very own Dr. Virginia Wright. Her dissertation focused on developing a decision aid for youth with brachial plexus birth injury as an avenue to empower families to make informed treatment decisions based on what matters most to them. Her current research program at the Sick Kids Division of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery centers on patient engagement, shared decision-making, and outcomes research in children and adolescents with upper extremity musculoskeletal conditions. Please welcome Emily.
Thank you, Dr. Chow. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And thank you to the Ward family and the BRI community for this recognition. It truly is an honor. I am delighted to talk about my dissertation on shared decision-making in youth with brachial plexus birth injuries and their families. All right, let's first start about my journey. Before I entered my doctorate, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I spent many years as an occupational therapist at Sick Kids, and I was surrounded by a very collaborative, multidisciplinary team. And being a therapist who specialized in assessment and rehabilitation of children with arm and hand conditions, clinical outcomes was really my strength. And so that led to clinical research, but in a very informal way. And so I entered my doctorate specifically to get more formalized research training and to work under Dr. Virginia Wright from BRI. And so my doctoral journey was very much the journey that I thought. I was going to get better scientific skills and again get good training, but it was also an unexpected journey. And that's because, well, I've always been someone who's kind of dabbled in the arts, the creative arts, and these are my doodles, what I call doodles. And I never thought about how my creative abilities or my drawings could actually apply or even enhance my research skills. And so in sharing about my thesis, I'm going to talk to you about my scientific journey, but also an unexpected journey. And this is actually a drawing I did after I started my doctorate, and it really kind of summarizes my ponderings about my personal development as a researcher. So I'll share 2 stories with you today. So let's first talk about shared decision-making. So how do you make decisions? So I really want you to think about this. Think about the last decision you made online, probably online shopping or a clinical research or clinical decision. How did you make that decision? Well, as clinicians, I really strongly believe that we pride ourselves in being very analytical. And this pyramid, evidence-based practice, really is representative of what we value. You know, studies with internal validity, very little bias is at the very top of this pyramid, and personal opinion is at the bottom. But you have to stop and think, are we always as analytical and objective as we think we are? Well, there is one theory of decision-making that says no. There's actually 2 basic systems of thinking that contribute to our decision-making. So this is system 1 is that fast, instinctive, that, you know, trust your gut type decisions that we make. Then when we slow down and make those deliberate decisions, that's our analytical thinking, and that's system 2. Now, the important thing about this decision-making theory is that it says that system 1 and system 2, we use both of them. Both of them can be effective, and both of them can be flawed. So let's apply this to how we provide care for our families. We provide family-centered care. So how do we make decisions? We make shared decisions. And that's why, because we have the clinicians coming together with a family, and the family is the youth or the child and the parents. And we come together to make a shared decision. So when our families come in and make a decision, sometimes they're making a decision heavily influenced by system one. So let me give you an example. Very typically, we may have a family that comes into our clinic who says, I just met another family that had the same surgery that's being recommended for my child. And that emotional connection they have with that family, or how that family's experience resonated with them, influences their decision. And that's system one at work. I'm not saying it's wrong, and it is helpful, but if left unchecked, it may lead to some mistakes in how they make a decision. So that's why when we come into shared decision making, the clinician can be very helpful to provide objective information for that family to slow down system one and use system two and make a decision that's best for them. And actually, that's really, really important for the youth. And I really want to focus on the fact that giving information to the youth is really important in that shared decision-making situation. So that's why my doctorate was to create a decision aid. And that's one such tool to tap into system two and slow down to system one. So what is this? A decision aid is basically nowadays an online tool, and that has three components. The first is that it defines the decision. Second, it provides evidence-based information. And the third is it has a worksheet or an exercise that helps the youth determine what matters most to them among the options that they have. And what we know from the literature in regards to the benefits of decision aid is that it improves an individual's knowledge, it helps them take a more active role in decision making, and it also decreases conflict stemming from feeling uninformed or feeling that they're not clear about what they value, about the options that they have. So putting this together, I sought out to do a decision aid for the youth that I work with clinically. And these are youth with brachial plexus birth injury. It's a nerve injury that happens at birth that affects the arm and hand on one side. Now, during childhood, many of these youth have a stiff elbow or an elbow flexion contracture. And what happens is they have to face a preference-sensitive decision. So what is that? It's a decision that has equipoise. That means there's no best choice. And so you might want to try splinting, casting, splinting, or surgery, but really there is no best choice because it's based on what the child and family values. But a decision still has to be made, and one of these options is actually doing nothing as well. So why is this decision a preference-sensitive decision? Well, this stiff elbow or the elbow contracture, it boils down to its etiology. The etiology is because the nerve injury from birth impairs the growth and the length of the muscles that flex or bend the elbow. So when we look at treatment, so either rehabilitation on the left or surgery on the right, no matter what we do, we can't restore full elbow extension or straighten the elbow fully or give full range of motion. And so a good example is on the left is a series of casts and splints by one of my clients that he wore throughout childhood. And if he didn't wear that cast or splint, then the elbow would bounce back up in a more severely bent position. So therefore, pursuing treatment really is values-based. It's based on what matters to that youth and that family. So how do you make a decision aid when there is nothing made in your field? So my first step was to create a conceptual framework. So this is my visual map of my methods. First, I started off with that evidence-based information. I did 2 knowledge synthesis studies. I looked at the literature on the characteristics of these elbow flexion contractures, its prevalence, its etiology. Then I did a systematic review because we wanted to know what the effectiveness of those options are, those treatment options for the youth. Putting this together, this is the information on the decision and that evidence-based information for the decision aid. Now there's that third component, what matters most to you. So this is important to find what the youth need in regards to decision making. So I did in-depth interviews and participant observation. So I interviewed young adults and youth and parents to look at how they made their decisions. And then it's very important in decision making to actually watch the families and the clinicians coming together in clinic and see the interactions and how they make shared decisions. I put this all together to make a decision aid prototype. This prototype was then field tested using measurement properties, taking a look at the sensibility or the practicalities of the decision aid, and then also the feasibility, and then also the comprehensibility of the decision aid. So wait, I just told you a little bit about my scientific journey. So what was that unexpected journey? So what was the journey about my personal development as a researcher? Well, remember this part when I had to do the what's most important to you and do that qualitative piece of in-depth interviews and participant observation. I felt it was really important to use an interpretive, this qualitative approach. And that really is because I wanted to get a sense of the meaning of the experiences of the youth and family, being very family-centered. However, this was uncharted territory for me. I did not know how to interpret and really do this well. And the other thing, furthermore, was that in a qualitative approach, I knew that I myself was a key analytical tool for the qualitative approach to analyze and interpret the meaning that the families were sharing with me. And I took this seriously, and I felt, oh no, in a sense that I know that I'm coming back from a quantitative perspective where I'm coming from outcome measures and outcomes research at a very procedural and factual perspective. And I said to myself, how do I interpret? So from my perspective, I really needed an intervention to help me to interpret. Well, serendipitously, I was approached during this time to be a graphic facilitator or recorder for a research workshop. I actually didn't know what that was, but I volunteered to do this because I'm a person that doodle. And what it was I was asked to visually represent what the research, the participants in the research workshop were saying and summarize it through drawing. And through this experience, I realized that drawing may be what I needed. It may be the intervention that could help me leap into interpretation. And so what I found was when I drew, it helped me to synthesize the ideas and concepts that I was seeing and put it on a piece of paper. And so I incorporated this into my research. After my participant observation sessions, I drew. And I drew one drawing, and I used an arts-based analytical approach. And what I found was, for me, when I had to reflect on why I drew what I drew, that helped me to be reflective, helped me to dig deep, helped me to look at the meaning behind what I saw, observed, and heard. And so an arts-based approach animated my analysis, helped my qualitative approach get deeper and have more richness. So in results of that, I found that there was a standalone results from my qualitative work to develop new shared understandings regarding the decision-making process of our families. And there's 4 themes that came out: was the importance of the youth's voice, also the importance of social and emotional influences on both the youth and the parent, also the presence of discord in parent and child decisions, and then also how clinician and family relationships influence decision-making. Now, putting this all together, we were able to make a decision aid with a real-world application, getting an understanding of how these decisions are made. And I'm proud to say that decision aid was adopted and just launched on the About Kids Health website at SickKids, and it's now available for our families to use, especially for our youth, as well as our clinicians, as a tool to help us make shared decisions with our families. So what does this mean for me as a researcher? And how did my doctorate change me? Well, this has helped me to change a new direction in my research, as well as who my partners are in my research. First, I started a new project on youth health literacy, which is now being completed by MSc OT students at the Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy program at University of Toronto. But very excitingly, also, I've started a new program of research in youth engagement. And my new project is a nationwide project that I'm going to co-create an online intervention with the youth that I work with and work alongside with to help youth and other children who have arm and hand disabilities to learn daily living skills and to support each other psychosocially. Now, I love this next picture because it really captures my research now. Because I now work with a very strong and collaborative team, but it includes these youth. And these are the youth that I work alongside that inspired me and helped me elevate my research. So to close, I want you to leave you with the quote from Emily Dickinson, who says, "Not knowing where the dawn will come, I open every door." And I encourage you to take upon any lesson or any opportunity to learn, and leave your door open, because you never know where it's going to head. And to end, I wanted to thank my entire research team. And there was a lot of people behind me in this research, and thank you to SickKids for funding my research. But above all, thank you to my research supervisor, an extraordinary supervisor and our leader in our field, Dr. Virginia Wright, who I hope that I would have the same attentiveness and able to be in tune with my students the way she is. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. We do have a question from the audience. Did your research consider how values are shaped within social and medical environments and how they evolve over time? For example, how is type 1 decision-making mediated and how does it change?
Great question. And that question is really applicable because that's the qualitative approach that I took, where I took an interpretive qualitative approach from Gadamer, and I'm not going to go into that, in a sense that my perspective as a researcher and a clinician comes together with our family. And when we see the meaning behind the decisions that we make, it's us coming together. And so those two things are paired together. And so therefore, yes, decisions made by System 1 are there, but again, we have to embrace this. We have to embrace this and acknowledge it, and then bring in the perspective of the clinician to provide information. I think it's very important that we have both System 1 and System 2, because families will need that support from other families and those type of experiences, but we need to be able to acknowledge it and know that it's there and know how to tap into that and to help families to make a more informed decision.
So I had a question, Emily. I was intrigued by your introduction of art into your own kind of research journey. And I assume that it's embedded in the tool as well. And I was wondering, how art, whether it's in the tool or not, in your perspective, how art may help us to transition from kind of the visceral, kind of emotional response, based decision making to a more kind of analytical decision making. Because you described how art helped you to be more reflective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom, for that question. I think art is definitely such a tool that we kind of underestimate. And I definitely did when during my doctorate, because I never even saw how it could be so possible for it to elevate my research. I think families value visual, 3D, creative ways to be educated. And I think it taps into emotion, it taps into our cognitive abilities. And I think that, yes, art is a very good tool to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. Okay. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have this morning. So thank you very much, Emily. I'll introduce now our third and final Pursuit Award presenter this morning, Dr. Stephanie Snow. Stephanie completed her PhD in clinical psychology at Dalhousie University and her pre-doctoral residency in Manitoba. Her dissertation research involved partnering with children with autism, their families, and healthcare providers to develop and explore the impact of the BALANCE program. It's an acronym that I'm sure Stephanie will explain to us. This program aims to improve the quality of healthcare delivered to children with autism around the time of surgery. Stephanie's research was conducted at and supported by the IWK Health Center in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she is now employed as a psychologist in the outpatient community mental health and addictions program. Stephanie remains committed to assisting initiatives aimed at increasing the capacity of health and mental health services to be responsive to the unique needs of the diverse spectrum of childhood, adolescent, and family experiences. Please welcome Stephanie.
Thank you, Dr. Chow. I'm glad to be here today. I was just reflecting as I get my slides ready here to, it's nice in this time to be able to meet in this way and to be able to hear about other people's projects and to hear, I think, similar and encouraging themes between the different projects in terms of the importance of engaging, you know, the people that these problems impact the most and thinking about systemic barriers and things. So I think you'll hear similar themes in my talk here today. As I talk about my dissertation research, and so I'm happy to do that, and I'm grateful to my co-supervisors, Drs. Jill Chorney and Isabel Smith, who supported me in doing this research. And thank you for having me here today. I'm going to start by just giving a bit of background about autism, which, as many of you will know, I'm sure, is a heterogeneous neurodevelopmental disorder that is estimated to affect about 1 in 66 children in Canada, and it's characterized by persistent core differences in social communication skills and repetitive and restricted interests and behaviors. But in addition to these core developmental issues, children with autism also have high rates of comorbid health-related issues, have increased healthcare-related costs compared to their peers, and have increased rates of healthcare service utilization. But unfortunately, in spite of this landscape, they have poor quality healthcare experiences, and there has been a recognized need to address this disparity. So my dissertation focused specifically on surgical experiences, as echoing comments in published commentaries and case studies. Healthcare providers at the IWK, where I conducted my research, had noted that they were caring for more and more children with autism and that there was room to improve these experiences. And from there, a partnership really emerged somewhat organically. And we decided to adopt a partnership-based approach because both the field of autism research and the broader field of healthcare improvement have really advocated for the importance of engaging the individuals with direct experience of the clinical problem being studied. So it's been really encouraging, as I mentioned, to hear about efforts that are happening in this way in many different projects this morning. So just as a brief overview, my program of research involves systematically gathering perspectives on surgery-related experiences, developing an intervention, and then piloting that intervention. So I'm going to start by talking about the study in my dissertation that focused on gathering those perspectives. And the rationale for this was really that concerns about children with autism surgery-related experiences are not new. They've been noted in publications dating back about 20 years, but there had been very little systematic research done to better understand these experiences. And so to begin filling this gap, I started by conducting a qualitative needs assessment. I used interpretive description, which is an established qualitative method for addressing applied clinical concerns, and talked to people about their experiences supporting children with autism around the time of surgery. I conducted qualitative analysis using verbatim transcripts of the interviews and employed a number of processes to establish both the credibility and trustworthiness of my analysis, which included checking back with the people that shared their perspectives with me. And participants in this part of my dissertation included both healthcare providers and a group of families of children with autism who had recently had surgery. So participants shared that their goal is to help children with autism get through the day of surgery as smoothly as possible, but the possibility of the child becoming distressed looms large. There is a sense that one little misstep could tip the child over the edge, the sense that it's an incredibly delicate balancing act. Participants shared that it is important to think about everybody involved. Parents and healthcare providers have to cross this balancing act with the child. Everyone involved needs to find their footing, and some parents and providers are quite comfortable, whereas others are less steady and seem preoccupied with worries about children falling into a distressed and inconsolable state. Unfortunately, worry can feed worry and interfere with building a strong working relationship. On the other hand, parents and providers who are comfortable help to keep each other steady, and by working together, they can develop an individualized care plan that will help to prop up the child. Sometimes children do become distressed, which can leave everyone involved feeling overwhelmed and stuck. If healthcare providers use these challenging moments to convey empathy, they can weave a safety net of support and strengthen relationships with families. This balancing act happens inside a hospital, and certainly the policies, procedures, culture, and available space and resources within that hospital system can hinder or facilitate the ability of everyone involved to see straight ahead and keep moving steadily forward. So the needs assessment really highlighted that many levels of factors, so individual, interpersonal, and systemic factors, interact to influence these experiences. And as such, there are many potential targets or pathways that could be pursued when considering how to improve these experiences. In consultation with the stakeholders involved in my research, the need for an intervention that increase the capacity of healthcare providers to consistently deliver high quality care to children with autism was identified as the next priority for my program of research. So I called this program Building Alliances for Autism Needs in Clinical Encounters, the Surgery Edition, or the BALANCE program. To develop BALANCE, I used the behavior change wheel, which is an established systematic and theory-driven approach for developing interventions coming out of the field of implementation science. And in doing so, I applied it to the field of autism research for the first time. And so essentially, steps in this approach allow you to figure out what the problem is, what intervention techniques hold the potential to solve the problem, how the intervention should be delivered, and what it should look like. And to kind of address these questions or tasks, I use 3 sources of data, including the literature, my own needs assessment, and ongoing formal and informal stakeholder engagements. Underpinning this behavior change wheel approach is the COM-B model of behavior, which proposes that 3 key determinants, capability, opportunity, and motivation, individually and synergistically influence behavior, which in turn influences them. So put more simply, in order for people to engage in a behavior, they need to know what they need to do and how to do it. They need to want to do it, and the circumstances around them need to allow them to do it. So the first question to address in designing balance was, what was it that healthcare providers needed to change or needed to do more of? And based on the sources of data that I reviewed, the identified target behavior was operationalized as falling under the umbrella of family-centered care, but defined specifically as a complex set of actions, including a number of behaviors that involve partnering with families, assessing the needs of each child and tailoring care accordingly, coordinating care, and expressing empathy and warmth. The next question to ask was, do they know to deliver this type of family-centered care and how to do it? Do they want to do it? And are there any barriers in the way? And we identified a need to target all 3 of these determinants. So the next task was to use mapping guidance provided by the behavior change wheel method to identify evidence-informed intervention techniques with the potential to contribute to change in each of these determinants, and to collaborate with children, families, and healthcare providers to identify how the techniques should be delivered and translate those techniques into intervention content. So to give an example of what I mean by this, behavioral rehearsal, or providing opportunities to practice family-centered care outside of the context in which care needs to be delivered, is one way to potentially increase the determinant of capability. So case studies were included in this intervention. Each case study was followed by questions prompting healthcare providers to rehearse aspects of family-centered care, and then they were given individualized feedback based on their responses. And individualized feedback is another technique proposed to increase the determinant of capability as well as motivation. So in total, 30 discrete techniques were included in the balance intervention. And per the stakeholder preferences, the majority of these interventions were delivered via 7 online e-modules. And the majority of the content was delivered by either healthcare providers, children with autism, or their families. Some techniques were also delivered via environmental restructuring. So for example, toolkits designed to facilitate the delivery of family-centered care were introduced on the day surgery unit. Local champions were identified and unit-wide communications were included. And healthcare providers who completed the intervention also received rewards and incentives for their participation. So the last piece of my program of dissertation research involved actually piloting balance at the IWK. So the goals of this pilot was to look at the feasibility, usability and acceptability, and the potential impact of the balance program. So I previously described in brief what balance involved, and this is just to show you what the implementation plan looked like. So the e-modules were rolled out over a period of 4 weeks, and then the environmental restructuring was timed in accordance with when information about that environmental restructuring was introduced in the e-modules, and feedbacks and rewards were given at the end. Healthcare providers provided feedback on the modules as they completed them, and also completed questionnaires at baseline, after completing balance, and 3 months later. And families of children with autism who had surgery on the unit in the 3 months before and the 3 months after balance also completed questionnaires. So in terms of the feasibility, the majority of healthcare providers consented to do the program, more people than we actually expected to participate. And of those who consented, a lot of them, 85%, actually completed all of the modules. They were able to complete it in a reasonable amount of time, and they engaged with the content, which we know because they answered the questions. So the results and findings related to feasibility suggested, I guess, that the balance program is feasible to do in a healthcare center. And then in terms of the question of usability and acceptability, more than 90% of the healthcare providers agreed that all learning objectives were met for the modules, and more than 98% of them responded favorably to items assessing how useful and well presented balance was, with the exception of one item, which was asking about the time required to complete the intervention, and the ratings for that were a little bit lower. So healthcare providers also provided quantitative ratings of their capability, opportunity, and motivations to deliver family-centered care. So this graph presents the estimated mean total score for all 3 of these determinants, as shown on the y-axis, across 3 time points as seen on the x-axis. And what you can see here is that overall, healthcare providers reported positive shifts in their overall capability, opportunity, and motivation to deliver family-centered care from baseline to follow-up, with most of the action happening from baseline to post-balance. Healthcare providers also provided ratings of the frequency of their use of behaviors consistent with the delivery of family-centered care when caring for children with autism. So this graph presents finding based on their responses to those questions. So again, what you can see is the estimated mean total score on the y-axis and the time points on the x-axis. And so overall, healthcare providers reported small, almost moderate positive shifts in their use of behaviors consistent with the delivery of family-centered care, with most of the action happening from post-balance to follow-up. And this made both logical and theoretical sense to me, as the change appears to come after the changes we saw in the determinants. And it's also when the healthcare providers would have had more time and opportunity to really put what they had learned in the e-modules into practice. Healthcare providers also responded to qualitative questions about what they learned and what they intended to do with the learning immediately after completing balance, as well as questions about how they had put what they learned into practice at 3-month follow-up. And generally, their responses indicated that they learned the value of family-centered care, that they intended to increase their use of family-centered care, and at the 3 months, the majority gave specific examples of how they had changed their practice in ways that were consistent with this intention. So families were also invited to share their perspectives on the delivery of family-centered care before and after balance implementation. And what you can see here again is the mean overall score on the y-axis, and then the group that families fell into in the x-axis. And what you can see is even though families had favorable perceptions before balance, which is common in our institution, we tend to get a bit of a halo effect, being that it's a tertiary care center. Families whose children received care after the implementation had even more favorable perceptions. So overall, findings from the pilot suggested that balance is feasible, it's usable and acceptable, and that it shows promise for having a positive impact. And then, of course, in interpreting these findings, it's important to keep in mind the various limitations of this program of what was largely exploratory research. And so one I'd like to highlight is, of course, the lack of comparators and controls. So definitive trials are certainly needed to further examine the impact of the balance program. But by engaging stakeholders using a systematic and theory-driven approach to develop balance and clearly articulating the target behavior, my dissertation addressed notable gaps in the relevant bodies of literature and strengthened the foundation of literature informing efforts to improve the quality of healthcare delivered to children with autism. And in sum, by adopting a systematic approach to gathering experiential knowledge and by following best practices to inform the development of balance, my mixed method program of stakeholder engaged research culminated in the development and preliminary evaluation of an intervention that met the clinically identified need to improve the delivery of healthcare to children with autism around the time of surgery. And then in terms of impact, since this rollout happened, it's been incorporated into the orientation for the day surgery unit at the hospital and also piloted at our hospital in different units, such as the surgical and medical inpatient wards, to look at what would need to be adjusted or changed for it to be applicable in other healthcare contexts. And it's also been implemented at BC Children's Hospital and Montreal Children's Hospital with a few more sites on the way. So it's been really encouraging to kind of see where this went even after I concluded my formal dissertation research on it and to continue seeing where it can go. I just want to end by thanking some programs and people that were involved in supporting me along the way. And most importantly, I want to thank the children, the families, and the healthcare providers without whom this research absolutely would not have been possible and certainly would not have been nearly as impactful. And I would welcome any of your questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. We do have a question from the audience. What do you see as the key drivers and barriers for increasing motivation for healthcare providers to provide family-centered care?
Yeah, so I think that I'm not sure in terms of broad scopes, but I can speak to some of what we looked at in my dissertation. So I did do some more sort of fine-tuned analysis, breaking apart, looking at how much of the change might have been related to change in capability, opportunity, and motivation. And what we saw was that most of the change seemed to be in healthcare providers' beliefs about their capability to deliver this kind of care, which made sense to me because when I did the qualitative study, it was really interesting to talk to healthcare providers, and I think that this has been reflected in lots of literature, in spite of healthcare providers sort of being able to list off best practices for how to work with these children. They would often say, but I don't know, I'm not an expert, I don't know how to work with these kids. So there was a real discrepancy between the level of knowledge that they had and their comfort in actually implementing the intervention. And then we did see some indicators that seemed to be what really shifted from the implementation of balance. But anecdotally, in terms of the motivation piece, hearing from the healthcare providers, what impacted them the most was the stories from the families and the children. So all of the information about autism was delivered by children with autism, and then same with the information about family-centered care and what the impact of it is. And healthcare providers and the qualitative comments often reflected on that and just how meaningful it was to hear from those voices in terms of in the program. And certainly if we look at the behavior change wheel and the mapping that is provided on it, persuasive communication is an intervention technique. Persuasive communication and credibility are two intervention techniques that influence motivation. And so I think whose voice could be more persuasive and credible than the voices of the people who are actually either doing this work or impacted by this work. So I think that was a big ingredient of the motivation.
Yeah, your findings of the willingness of the healthcare providers to shift to family-centered care is really encouraging. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could give a practical example in the surgical care context of something that they change in practice.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting, we've heard family-centered care talked about a few times today, and I think in pediatric healthcare centers, it's something that we really value and take to heart, but measuring and defining family-centered care has been somewhat of a challenge. So Ultimately, for my dissertation, we developed a measure to, or began developing a measure to, in terms of what we meant specifically by that. So an example for assessing needs in this case would be, I assessed the sensory needs of the child with autism. I assessed the communication needs of the child with autism. I assessed the emotional needs of the child with autism. And then there was, as part of the toolkits that was introduced on the unit, actually a checklist that healthcare providers were given. Similar to, there's been some work in other health centers developing passports or information about how do you gather what the needs might be and how do you translate that. And so it was really specific to what would you need to do in this case to be able to effectively individualize care for that one. And then in terms of the partnering, it was things like, you know, I used collaborative statements. I engaged the parents and the child. So really operationalize the behavior in a fine-grained way. Yeah, so it was, those are sort of the four broad headings that things fell under that I presented here today, but we tried to get as specific as possible to really get rid of any sort of vagueness in terms of how we were operationalizing and defining that, because it's been a challenge in the literature.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Good, okay. So that's all the questions we have for Stephanie. So thank you again, Emily, Stephanie, and Patrick, for your fascinating presentations this morning. Indeed, I think there are some common themes that ran throughout these presentations. I got a real sense of valuing the client and family's voice and partnering with families in research, and really bringing out the human dimensions of care and disability, which is one of the themes here at the Bloorview Research Institute. And recognizing that the voice of the clinician or the professional is not necessarily privileged over that of the family perspectives. And in Patrick's work, seeing that the social forces at play can be so incredibly strong, and the emotional experiences of families being a key factor in decision-making, in Emily's work. And I think appealing to the humanity of healthcare providers in Stephanie's work. So thank you all for aligning your presentation so well thematically. I know that was coincidental, but really helped bring across the impact this morning. At this time, I'd like to say a few words about the application process for our annual Pursuit Award. Upon submission, each candidate's research was evaluated on the basis of academic excellence, potential for success as research in the field of child disability, excellence in knowledge translation, research productivity, and impact on childhood disability care. We received highly competitive applications, and the finalists that presented to you this morning had the highest scores and exhibited the most remarkable research promise. We will now present the awards. The winners, please join me on stage. Oh, sorry, those are from last year's notes. So the awards, in third place, receiving $1,000 is Dr. Emily Ho. In second place, receiving $2,000 is Dr. Patrick Takira. And in first place, receiving $3,000 is Dr. Stephanie Snow. Congratulations to all of our Pursuit Award recipients. To close off today's event, I would like to extend my most sincere thanks to everyone for being part of the 2020 Pursuit Award ceremony, including our judges, distinguished guests, and award family, finalists, and all of you in attendance. Congratulations again to all of our presenters. You are expanding the childhood disability research community in new and exciting ways. While we have been wrestling with issues of the pandemic personally and socially, there's arguably a different virus that doesn't often make national headlines or command a population response. And that's the face of injustice that is the everyday reality of many families living with disabilities, hardships that are endemic to our societal systems, exclusionary practices that are systemic. Fortunately, members of our senior team, like Stuart Wong, our VP of Communications here, and Minu Sikan, our Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer, and our CEO, Julia Hennigsberg, have worked hard to advocate for the considerations of individuals with disability during the pandemic, including the restatement of the ADP funding program that families rely on, and specific mention of people with disabilities in decision-making guidance relating to care prioritization. In the Research Institute here at Holland Bloorview, we have the likes of Dr. Ross, Mula, Lindsay, Gibson, and others who are addressing social justice challenges in ways that are not only academic, but with real potential to bring about policies that are philodemic for the love of the people. Indeed, achieving the most meaningful and healthy futures requires simultaneous and consistent efforts on multiple fronts. At Holland Bloorview, we are truly in a unique position through our unchanging passion, our enduring commitment to children and families, to bring about lasting change through excellence in science, teaching, care, and advocacy. I started this morning's remarks about comfort, about finding comfort in the unchanging amid changing times. In coincidental symmetry, I conclude with the hope in the change that comes with unchanging convictions. That is perhaps why these 10th Pursuit Awards have been so remarkable. Change juxtaposed with the constant, in pursuit of that no boundaries future. Thank you again to all of our winners for inspiring us this morning. I look forward to celebrating with you next year at the 2021 Pursuit Awards ceremony. Thank you all and stay safe.